Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the Images in Focus show. I'm David Swindler, and with me today is my good friend, Juan Pons. Juan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Looking forward to this last installment on this series on selecting your lenses.
Yeah, me too. In the first couple episodes, we talked a lot about the important considerations that you need to take into account when looking at lenses and choosing which ones you're going to purchase. And in the most recent episode, we talked a lot about the image quality considerations. But in this last and final episode, we're going to dwell on some other important things that you should look at when designing your lens kit. Juan, how about you take it away?
Sounds good. Here we go. Okay, so another aspect here to talk about in lenses is going to be your focus motors and your focus speed and a focus limiter. So not all lenses focus at the same speed. You think, okay, well, the same, two different lenses connected to the same camera. The camera is the one that's driving the autofocus. Why do they focus at different speeds? Or why do they focus one less accurately than the other? Well, there are many factors that come into that. One is, the simplest one to think about is aperture, maximum aperture. When lenses are autofocusing, they're usually autofocusing at the widest aperture. Well, guess what? A lens that has a widest aperture at 2.8, the sensor can gather a lot more light than when that maximum aperture is 5.6. So guess what? More light allows the camera to do a much more accurate job at autofocusing. So that's one scenario or one factor to consider. Another one is the focus motors that are inside the camera. Some may be faster than others, and they may be more responsive. So that's why, again, it's important to test out and do real-world testing on the particular lens that you're using to figure out, which one meets your requirements. If you're shooting, still lives, autofocus, fast autofocus may not be such a important thing to you because you're going to be shooting the camera up on a rig and set up, and you may be doing manual focus. So you may actually consider just getting a manual focal lens. But if you're shooting fast action photography, sports, let's say you want a lens that has good compromise or good qualities in the autofocus performance, as well as a wide aperture, so you can gather as much light in those darkened, indoor arenas and gyms, right? So very important to consider those things. And the other thing that I also want to mention briefly, because it's something that you don't see a lot of people talking about, or a lot of people are confused by, is the focus limiters. And that's what this switch is that you're seeing in this graphic highlighted by the red square. And what that's doing is limiting the amount of travel that focus that has to travel inside the lens when you're trying to focus on something, so that the camera doesn't have to search from subjects that are close to you all the way to infinity. If you're shooting something that's far away, you are better off setting that focus limiter to the infinity to 15 meters. And what that means that the camera is only going to focus on subjects that are 15 meters away, all the way out to infinity. So that's going to allow the camera to do faster and more accurate focus on those faraway subjects. And the camera, in case, for example, the camera loses track of that subject, it's not also going to rack all the way to 4.5 meters to the minimum focusing distance for this lens, and then rack back out trying to find focus on your subject. And then by that point, your subject would have been gone. So very important to think about, what kind of limiter your camera has to the style of shooting that you're doing. Oftentimes when I'm shooting wildlife, I do have my focus limiter set to the infinity setting, so that the camera just focuses on my subjects that are further away. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, so something else to think about is teleconverters. How can you use, teleconverters, and what are they for? I see people saying, oh, teleconverters are magic. I can just slap a 2x teleconverter and my 400 lens magically converts into an 800 millimeter lens. And there's some truth to that, but that's not the entire story. Teleconverters, what they do is they do increase the magnification of your lens. And they are come in these designations that you'll see very often, 1.4, or 1.7, or 2. And what that does is, all you have to do is multiply the length of your lens, the focal length of your lens, by that number. So a 2x teleconverter, if you're shooting with a 600 millimeter lens, it will convert it into a 1200 millimeter lens. However, there's some drawbacks that you're going to get from that, some compromises that you're going to have to make. The first one is image quality. The image quality is going to degrade, and sometimes significantly, especially the more magnification you have in your teleconverter, the more your image quality will be compromised. And image quality, the compromise in that image quality may be sharpness, it may be aberrations, certainly will be focus speed. You're going to compromise on focus speed because now you have less light coming into your lens. So a 1.4
and also your bokeh.
Well, and also your bokeh. That's actually a great point as well. That will be compromised as well. It will change significantly. A 1.4 teleconverter cuts the amount of light coming into the lens by 1 stop, versus a 2x cuts it by 2 stops. So if your lens, think about this, if your lens is let's say a f4, and you're using a 1.4 teleconverter, now the maximum aperture for that lens is going to be at 5.6. So you're losing a full stop of light, and that's going to affect both your depth of field as well as your autofocus speed, because now your camera doesn't have as much light to autofocus, so it's going to slow down your autofocus. So, all things being, the same, all things being equal, I would try to stay away from teleconverters as much as possible. Yes, I do use them from time to time when I need to, but I usually use the 1.4. Never do I use a 2x. I don't even own a 2x because to me that's way too much compromise in image quality and focus speed. The other thing to think about is matching brands of autofocus, of teleconverters to your lens. I've seen people use a Canon lens with a Sigma teleconverter, and the image quality just drop precipitously. So try to match those. If you have a Sigma lens, use a Sigma teleconverter. If you have a Canon lens, use a Canon teleconverter. And in some cases, you may need to match versions of those teleconverters with the versions of the lens. Just to give you an idea, I used to have a 500 millimeter lens from Canon. And it was one of the first IS lenses, the version 1, if you will, not version 2 or 3. And with those, I often had to use a version 2 teleconverter, version 1 or version 2 teleconverter. If I use a version 3 teleconverter, the image quality went down. You'd think that because it's a newer teleconverter, that it would improve the image quality, but that version 3 teleconverter was really made for version 2 of the lens. So that's another thing to consider as well when you're using teleconverters. So as a general rule, I try to avoid them, but I'll use them when needed. And by the way, I prefer to use them in almost all cases with prime lenses, not so much with zoom lenses. There's a few exceptions to that. For example, the Sony 100 to 400 works remarkably well with a 1.4 teleconverter from Sony. But almost all others, like that same teleconverter, 1.4, is no good with the Sony 200 to 600, for example. So it really depends, and again, something else for you to test in real-world scenarios. Okay, so another item here that we want to talk about is image stabilization. Again, another thing to consider about when you're buying these lenses. Do you need image stabilization? And if so, how much advantage does that image stabilization provide? You will see 3 different names for the image stabilization. Canon calls it image stabilization. Nikon calls it vibration reduction. Sony and I think Olympus and Fuji all call it optical stabilization. So, when you see those terms, they're pretty interchangeable, but they don't work, all the same. Some are better than others. And some lenses, the optical stabilization will work better than others. So again, something else for you to test and for you to consider when you're selecting a lens. And you'll see that those lenses oftentimes, especially on the longer end, not so much on the shorter end, but on the longer end, you'll see that some of those lenses will have 3 different modes, either 2 or 3 different modes of image stabilization, mode 1, 2, or 3. And in almost all cases, at least all cases that I'm aware of, mode 1 is the camera does image stabilization both in the vertical as well as the horizontal axis, versus in mode 2, it's used for panning subjects. And some systems will only work in the horizontal axis. Some systems will work either in the horizontal or vertical axis when you're in mode 2, but it's really for panning subjects. And in most cases that I'm aware of, mode 3 is kind of another panning mode, but a little bit different. It actually, I know, for example, on Canon, it engages the image stabilization only when you press the shutter. It doesn't engage when you have the shutter halfway down. Versus mode 2 does engage when you press the shutter halfway down. It's just something to think about. And then something that we've seen most recently is in-body image stabilization, where the stabilization is not really made on the lens itself, but is done on the body of the camera. And that has some advantages and some disadvantages. You know, the in-body image stabilization allows basically any lens to be image stabilized. So you could use, you know, a stabilization even on manual lenses. And in some camera systems, the in-body image stabilization can work in conjunction with the lens image stabilization, you know, but not always. So again, that's something for you to research to find out whether the combination of lenses works or not. In some cases, it may not make sense for you to get a particular lens that has image stabilization if your camera already has it, because the one in the camera and the lens may not be used when the one in the camera is engaged. So, and that could save you some money.
Yeah, for sure. And as we talked about in the first episode, this also may be a consideration whether you go with OEM matching lenses or third party, because many times if you put a third party lens on that camera body, the advanced image stabilization features will not be available.
Right. Right. And it's another consideration also when you think about, you know, older lenses. You know, I know, for example, some people that love to shoot with older like 50 millimeter lenses that are super inexpensive, super sharp, and they don't have image stabilization or even autofocus, but they're okay because even at those focal ranges that they're shooting, you know, they prefer to do manual focusing. So again, you know, another thing to consider, image stabilization is amazing, you know, especially on longer lenses. It can be very helpful when you're shooting in low light or fast moving subjects. So just something to think about. But again, you know, it may not work for the type of photography that you do. Okay.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about filters. Filters. Go ahead, Juan.
So you know, filters, you know, they kind of come in two different types. We have circular versus square filters, and you know, it used to be that I don't know about you. I think you're the same thing as I do. I used to shoot quite a bit with filters, with square filters. I don't do that as much anymore because I instead do, you know, exposure merging to try to compensate for not using the square filters. But you know, nowadays most of us are using circular filters to polarize the scene that we're trying to photograph, to saturate some of those colors, remove reflections off of the water, or to slow down our shutter speed by cutting the amount of light that's coming into our lens. And you know, again, you have two types. You have circular versus square. I tend to like the circular ones better because I can. They're smaller, more compact. I have to carry less stuff with me, and they do come in multiple different sizes. You have to match the size to the lens that you're using, or you can use step up or step down. People call them either step up or step down rings that allows you to use a filter on other lenses. So, and that's typically what I use. I use filters that are 82 in size, kind of the larger size filters, and then I'll carry one or two rings to fit those same filters on a 77, on a lens that takes a 77 filter. So one technique to take in order to carry less stuff on the field and also save a little bit of money, because certainly the step-down rings are going to be a lot cheaper than those than the filters themselves. But then the other thing to think about is, as we talked earlier, on these super wide-angle lenses with those bulbous front elements, you may need to have these big filter systems to use. And we have a picture here of one used on one of the Nikon lenses that requires, what is it, like 100 millimeter filter?
Some of those can be about 110 up to 150 millimeter.
Yeah, they can be very big and very, like we mentioned earlier, bulky and I personally, I really do not like using the square filters because, I know newer ones are a little safer, but older ones, tended to like slide down and crash down on the ground, right? I know that's happened to me a number of times. So, anything else to add on the filters themselves, you think?
No, I think you hit on a lot of those points. And, one of the things that I always have to remind people of is if you're using like these screw-on filters with these wide-angle lenses, you're going to want to make sure you get the slim mount filters. So they make like regular thickness filters, and they make ones that are really thin. So the thin ones on a wide-angle lens are going to have far less vignetting than will the ones that stick out a lot further. Now, the downside is if you have like a slim mount polarizer, it is going to be harder to take that filter off at the end of the day because you have less surface to grab onto. And so a slim mount filter may not be appropriate for all of your lenses, but it certainly would be a good consideration for a wide angle lens.
Right. And the other thing going along with that is, avoid stacking the filters if you can, because, what that's going to do is kind of protrude the filters a little bit further off from the lens. So it may introduce vignetting a lot quicker. And in that case, you may need to zoom out or zoom in a little bit to try to get past that vignetting so you don't get that vignetting in place. Plus, when you add multiple filters, you're exacerbating any reflections that may come into play in a situation like that. And you're also reducing the image quality because that light is going through all this glass as it's making its way to your lens. So the more you can avoid stacking, the better. The good news is that nowadays you can get combinations of filters, which is the ones that I use. You can get a polarizer, for example, with a built-in neutral density in it. So not only does it cut down the light by 1 or 2 stops or 3 stops or whatever, however many stops, but it's also a polarizer and it's all built into one lens. So if I need to do both things, use a neutral density and a polarizer, I can combine that into one lens and not have to worry about any vignetting or reducing the image quality or any reflections, internal reflections that may happen in there. Now, I know this is a topic that we kind of like to talk about is UV filters because we get this question all the time, right? Should we use UV filters on our lenses? Take it away, David. What do you think?
Well, I'll tell you, the short answer is no. Right. I've stopped using UV filters years ago, and I do not regret that decision one bit. If you think about it, a UV filter is essentially just a cheap piece of glass that you're putting in front of your fancy, expensive lens. And with digital photography, it does nothing for us. Back in the film days, we did want to remove UV light from the photos, but now we don't really have to do that. And so the reason why they continue to persist is people believe that they offer you lens protection. And in fact, that's actually just an old wives' tale. They've done all these kind of tests where they drop things on lenses, and the UV filters will shatter at the slightest little impact. And they've shown that same impact on your front lens element does nothing to it. That front lens element is actually quite tough. And the thing about it is if you did happen to damage that front lens element, you're probably going to damage other things within your lens too, like your focusing motors and so forth. The good thing is the front lens element can always be replaced independent of other parts of your lens, so you can always send that in and get it repaired.
It's usually one of the cheapest repairs you can do to a lens is having that front element replaced.
It actually is. The more expensive stuff is like, the moving mechanisms inside your lens, like your focus motors and stuff like that. And so the best protection for your lens is just to use the lens hood. Because then if it falls or anything, you're protecting the threads around your lens and you're protecting your front glass. So just get in that habit of just always using that lens hood and just ditch those UV filters. The other thing that I just cringe when I see people doing is they have this UV filter that just stays on their lens all the time. And then they go to put a polarizer on. They put the polarizer on top of the UV filter. Oh, just kills me. You have so many internal reflections. Your vignetting looks atrocious. Your sharpness goes way down. Just don't do that kind of stuff.
I'll do one better for you. I've seen people that will use a UV filter on their lens, and then they'll go out and shoot astrophotography with that UV filter in front.
Oh no!
Because they forget it's there. And guess what happens? You get multiple copies of all those stars. You get all these internal reflections in the lens, and it really is a complete and utter disaster. But you said something that's really important, and I want to stress that because it's something a lot of people don't think about and don't talk about. You said, for example, if your lens falls, it's better protected by your lens hood, not just because of the front element, but because of the threaded ring. Guess what? If you're using a UV filter and your lens falls, the brunt oftentimes is going to be on that ring on the outside. And if you damage that ring, yes, there are some lenses where that ring can actually be replaced relatively inexpensive, but in most cases it's not. It's actually a very expensive thing to replace because they have to replace a big portion of the lens to replace that threaded ring in the front. Versus if you had the hood, even though the hoods can be expensive, they're nowhere near as expensive as a repair on a threaded ring or on a front element. So, that's why lens hoods is the best way to protect your lens. Take those UV filters and throw them away.
Good advice.
Yep. Okay. So next one. And then we have, specialty lenses that we're not going to get into because these could actually take, whole episodes unto themselves, whether they're macro lenses, which I love and I use, or tilt shift lenses that we use for architectural photography, or they can be used in nature photography as well to extend or change your depth of field, as opposed to to extend the depth of field out to the horizon, if you will, or fisheye lenses that can be used in very tight quarters, or when you're doing like interior photography or VR, virtual reality type work. There are lots of other, and you have these incredible macro lenses that can do, 5 times magnification, very specialized kind of stuff. But we're not going to get into that in this episode. We may do an episode in the future. We may go a little bit into some of these specific lenses, but just keep in mind that there's a whole plethora of other lenses out there that you may consider based on the type of photography that you're doing or that you may be interested in doing. You never know. Okay, so having said all this, I want to share with you my kit, my essential kit, as well as the extra lenses that I carry. And you'll see that, almost all of my lenses are zoom lenses. For me, I use a 16-35 f2.8 on the wide end of my spectrum. And that's really the only lens I have on the wide end because I'm not that much of a wide end photographer. And yes, I have the f2.8 because, it allows me to use that lens for multiple things, both for astrophotography as well as for landscape. And it's just one lens. Yeah, I would rather, and I used to have a 16-35 f4. I would rather have that lens because it's a lot smaller, more compact, much lighter weight. But then it would mean that for astrophotography, I would need to have something else. And I did that for a while. But then I thought better of it. I said, I want to reduce the amount of gear that I have, the amount of weight that I'm carrying. So I went ahead and went with the 16-35 f2.8 because it gives me a multi-use lens, even though it's kind of bigger and heavier than the others. Then, we talked about the kind of, I'm just stranded on a deserted island and I could only have one lens with me. Well, that will be the 24-105 because I can use that for just about everything, for both landscape, and if I need to, I can do stitch panoramas with that to get a wider field of view. And 104, although it's not, for some reason I wrote 104 up there. It's a 105 millimeter lens. Sorry for that mistake. Even though 105 is not the longest, it's still pretty good for general photography, general landscape photography, even for portraiture. Not so much for birds that are at a distance or wildlife that's far away, but I can always crop if I needed to and be able to get to those subjects. And then for me, I jump into the 200-600. These 3 lenses are the ones that I carry with me just about every time I go anywhere, and they give me a range from 16 to 600, which is pretty wide range. Now, I do have a gap. You'll notice I have a gap between 100 and 200. And that's, I would rather not have that gap, but if I had to have a gap, For me, that would be it. And what I did was I analyzed my shooting habits and my images. And this Lightroom is great for this because I can select a bunch of images and then see in the metadata how many images were shot at different focal ranges. And I found out that, that middle range between 70 to 200 is not one that I shoot at very often. And even if I need to, if I'm in a situation where I think I may want that range, I will use one of my extra lenses that I may bring for those occasions, like the 100 to 400. That will give me a little bit more of that range that I may be missing by not using that 200 to 600. That 100 to 400, as we talked about earlier, one of the great things about that is that it allows me to also focus a lot closer than the 200 to 600. So when I'm shooting subjects that are up close, like I mentioned earlier, butterflies, dragonflies, flowers, things of that nature, that 100 to 400 is actually a very versatile range for that range. And then on the macro side, which I do as well, I love the 90 millimeter macro that I'm using. I've used different macro focal ranges. I used to own a 180, which is good for certain situations. But, the problem with the bigger macro lenses is that they get heavy and much more difficult to handhold when you're trying to, chase a subject down, whether it's a butterfly or a dragonfly or something like that. Yes, it keeps you further away from your subject so you don't scare them as easily, but they're just that much harder to hold when you're trying to stay nice and still using a macro. And then the wider macros, to me, are just too wide. So the 90 macro, for me, it's a great range. So really, at this point in time, these are the 5 lenses that I use for all the photography that I use. The 3 at the top, my essential kit, is what I take everywhere with me. And then the other 2 I take with me depending on the type of shooting that I'm doing. So how about you? Why don't you share your kits with us?
So I'm actually very similar in the fact that I prefer zoom lenses because I like to cover the entire range of focal lengths. And for a lot of the shooting I do, walking closer or further away from my composition isn't always possible. There's cliffs, canyons, and other things that get in the way. So being able to have that zoom versatility really speeds up my workflow and reduces the amount of lens changes I have to do. So I really like my 16 to 35 millimeter f2.8 lens, because it allows me to do both astrophotography and just regular landscape photography. So if I'm going to go backpacking and I'm trying to cut my weight, I'll just take that 16 to 35 millimeter lens, knowing that it can work for both situations. Now, if you're not going to do like astrophotography, like an f4 lens will work just fine. In fact, that will lighten your load considerably, not having that extra stop of light. The middle range I always think is really important, that 24 to 105 millimeter. You'll use that for so many different situations. And then my shooting habits are a little different than Juan's. This is why we mentioned that you have to analyze your shooting habits. I actually find I shoot a lot of shots in that 100 millimeter to 200 millimeter range. So I really like my 100 to 400, and that's what always comes with me in the backpack. It also always comes with me because it's smaller and lighter than its larger 200 to 600. Now, let's say I'm going on
curious. Sorry to interrupt, but I find really curious that, a lot of landscape photographers, which is, what you're mostly, what you're most well known for, will love to shoot the 70 to 200. They call it one of their favorite lenses, but you use the 100 400 instead, which is kind of neat.
Yeah, because I like to have it be kind of I use it more of the jack of all trades where,
right.
It can shoot those 100 to 200 millimeter focal lengths for like my landscape work, and it's incredibly sharp for that. But I can also use it to shoot wildlife if I'm out in the field and, there's a wildlife opportunity that I didn't expect. Well, now I have a lens to go shoot it with.
And you can compress those faraway landscapes as well when you're shooting at 400, because even those faraway mountain ranges at 400 can be pretty spectacular.
Absolutely. So it has just such a wide range of uses, and it's not a huge lens and it's not a super heavy lens. So it's something I can justify taking with me. And as I say, the best...
It's not that different from the 70 to 200 f2.8, right?
Well, I actually think it's lighter. In
Oh,
the
wow.
70 to 200 f2.8 is, for outdoor use, I don't find it to be that useful. If I was a portrait or wedding photographer, that would be my go-to lens.
Right.
So often people ask me, oh, I have this 70 to 200. How about I just use it with the 2x teleconverter? I always have to tell them, don't do that. You're way better off just getting that 100 to 400 and utilizing that for its intended purpose.
Right.
Now, as far as my optional equipment, I love that 12 to 24 millimeter lens that Sony makes. It's an f2.8. It's wonderful for night skies. It's wonderful for creative compositions where I like to get really close to a foreground subject. It just really enhances my creativity when I'm out in the field or when I'm in those like slot canyons and things where I really want that super wide angle field of view.
So let me ask you a question before you move on from the 12 to 24. So I'm curious, and I'm sure people are listening will also be interested in knowing, is, you have the 16 to 35 and then the 24-105. Why use 16 to 35 to 8 for, like, example, Astro versus using the 12 to 24 for Astro?
Well, you can use them interchangeably. That's for sure. But I will say that the optical aberrations on that 16 to 35 are much worse than what I get on that 12 to 24. So on the 12 to 24, I found that they have controlled the spherical aberration and the astigmatism far better than they did on the 16 to 35 f2.8. Cool. So if I'm going to do night photography, I'm always going to reach for that 12 to 24 because my image quality is 2 times better.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
And the other thing is that 12 to 24 lens, it's not that heavy. So somehow they designed that so it's pretty compact. It's lightweight. It's something I don't mind just having in my backpack for when I need it.
But the challenge with that one, right, because it's got the bulbous front, is that using a filter with it for landscape work is difficult.
Yes, it is. So if I was going to just take one wide-angle lens with me on a backpack trip, the 16 to 35 is what I'm going to choose because I like to use filters, for my landscape photography.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing to me that I did not know is that 12 to 24 performs better for Astro than the 16 to 35. That's cool.
Oh, yeah, it is much better. I was really impressed by how well Sony designed that lens.
Cool.
So for, I have shot a lot with fisheyes in the past. I don't tend to do it as much now, but, they're fun if you're trying to add some creativity to your work. And then, of course, if I'm doing like a wildlife center trip or something, I love that 200 to 600 millimeter lens just for the extra reach it gives me. Or if I'm doing something like shooting full moons and things like that, where I really want a lot of telephoto firepower, that's the lens to bring. And then for macro, I found that I haven't shot as much macro ever since I went to full frame cameras. It was so much easier back with the crop sensor cameras. But what I really enjoy shooting with macro are bugs. And with the bugs, you need a good working distance because if you get a lens too close to them, they freak out and run away. Right. So that's why I tend to prefer the 150 millimeter macro. Yeah, it's a bigger, heavier lens, but it works for what I'm intending to shoot.
Yeah. Cool. Excellent.
So let's just run over just a quick checklist here, just kind of an overview of what we've kind of talked about in these episodes. First of all, you have to decide how you are going to use that lens. And then second, you have to determine what is your budget. And then what are the compromises that you're willing to make? Because as we said, there is no one lens that's going to do everything. You have to determine what's important to you and then look for a lens that's going to meet those needs. And then you have to decide what kind of image quality you want or need. And of course, that also ties in with your budget because the cheaper lenses are simply not going to are not going to deliver on the image quality front the same as will the more expensive L series type glass. And then you have to look at your build quality, the focusing speed, the image stabilization, the weather sealing. All that stuff comes into play into how you're going to use your lens. And then ask yourself, how does this fit into my kit? is this just an extra lens that's going to add lots of extra weight and I'm going to get sick of having it in my backpack? Or is it something that I really need? And that's why we put this last bullet point there, need versus want. Our wants can go on indefinitely.
Yes.
But the fact is, too much gear does not free you up as a photographer. In fact, I find it bogs people down. They're constantly trying to change lenses, or they have too much weight in their backpack, or they're missing shots because they can't decide which lens to put on. You know, it's better to have gear that fits your shooting style, that's very streamlined, rather than having everything under the sun and having it cramp your style.
Yeah, I mean, I've had people on workshops that will have, 8 different prime lenses, and you'll see them in a particular location, and try 6 of those prime lenses to try to find the right perspective, the right, and it took forever. And the sun was going, the light was changing. They couldn't, and in the end, they didn't get as good of a shot had they been able to just stick with one lens and make the best that they could with that particular selection. I agree with you 100% that oftentimes having more is a hindrance. It actually slows you down and actually leads to indecision. Not to everybody, but for most people, that is definitely an issue. And that the need versus want is always one that, I know I struggle with. If I see a new cool lens that comes out, I'm like, man, that would be cool to use and whatnot. And then I wait a couple of days and I think about it and, do I really need it? Why would I want that? Why would I use that versus this lens? And, I think over time, I think you and I have the advantage of having been doing this for such a long time and doing it so intensely that we've been able to refine, what works for us, right? And that's something that people have to do. They have to, hopefully it won't take them as long as I know it took me to get to that point. So hopefully some of the knowledge that we're imparting on you guys will help you get to that point a lot quicker. Okay, so the last thing we want to talk about is resources. A couple of 2 resources that as we were going to putting this presentation together, I thought we'd share with you guys. I use a website called DxO Labs, and you can search for these on your favorite search engine. And DxO Labs, what they do is they rate the performance, especially the sharpness and contrast of different lenses. And you can compare one lens versus the other. They have a really great tools online to do that. But as I said before, as we said before, this is all bench testing. It's all about those scientific measurements for that specific lens or even that specific camera, because they do ratings on those as well. So use those with a grain of salt. Use them as a basis for selecting when you're trying to then figure out all these other aspects that we just spoke about, especially on that last checklist of things to think about. So DxO Labs, check them out. It's a great resource. And then the other one, if you're really into lenses and want to find out more about some of those MTF charts that David showed you earlier, or how sturdy the build quality of some of the lenses, one of the resources that I found very useful is the Lens Rental blog. So Lens Rental is a company that rents lenses, and I recommend not just lenses, but they rent cameras, and I recommend that to a lot of my workshop participants when they need a second body or a specific lens. But the owner of Lens Rentals is a lens geek, and he will take apart lenses to look how well they're built. He will compare or measure the performance of lenses, and the way that they do it is they select 10 different copies of one specific lens and run it through a gamut of testing to find out how much they vary between lens copies and to come up with a average rating for that specific lens. So something else to look at. They don't rate every lens that's out there. He does what he finds interesting, but if you're lucky enough that one of your lenses you're considering, or one of the lenses that you have, he's been rating, it's an amazing resource. So, definitely check it out. Well, folks, that's it for this mini series on selecting your lenses. We very much enjoy having you, and thank you for joining us. If you found this content useful, We encourage you to subscribe and share with your friends, and also join us on the Facebook group. And stay tuned. We'll be releasing more series soon. So hope to see you in the very near future.